Good evening. Welcome back for most of you, but welcome to the Cairo Lectures, the Saturday evening lecture tonight entitled The Opposite of Faith and the Rehabilitation of Doubt. Just very quickly to introduce the Cairo Lectures, as I know most of you have been here for at least one of the previous sessions, is that to remind you that our program that you got in the narthex has a few things within it. One is the question cards. We encourage written questions. It's a little easier for Dr. Lindsay to go through if we can kind of read it and look at it. And you see there also anyone who would like to help support the Cairo Lectures, there's an envelope there. I just dropped those in the offering plate that is right in front of the communion font as you would leave. And then finally, a reminder, we are looking for your feedback of the Cairo Lectures. And there's a survey in there. And please fill that out to find out how we can improve this program. What I would like to do to introduce tonight is a little bit less about tonight and a little more of some things coming for the Cairo Lectures, which is, of course, the first thing is that this is not the end. Tomorrow morning, Dr. Lindsay will be here, both doing the Adult Education Hour as a Cairo Lecture, 9:45 to 10:45. It won't be here in the sanctuary, it'll be in our parish hall right next to it. And for those of you joining from home, we're not able to live stream from the parish hall, so we are going to record it, and later that afternoon it will be uploaded online. So it will be available to you, just not live. And also, Dr. Lindsay is going to be preaching here at Central Lutheran at both services, 8:30 and 11, and so we invite you to join us for worship. The other thing I want to tell you about that's coming related to this is one of the most frequent things we hear from the Cairo committee is, it was a wonderful experience, but it was so much, so fast, we didn't have a time to really absorb it. And what we're going to do on our, we call it Together Tuesdays, is the Tuesday evening we have kind of our church night where we have a common meal at 5:15, and at 6 there's a variety of activities, but one is an adult education hour. And not this coming Tuesday, but beginning October the 29th, we are going to start a 6-week series that will be called, I believe, Help My Unbelief. And what we are going to do is, because these are all recorded, we're going to watch short excerpts of these lectures and have time for conversation and discussion that will hopefully unpack some elements, both for any clarity issues, but also for how do we make this alive in our lives. We have this kind of mountaintop experience with a Cairo lecturer. Now what are we going to do with it? And so that's what we're going to be doing. So I invite anyone who's interested, those are going to be Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. starting a week from Tuesday. So that's the 29th. And we're going to follow that series all the way up until Advent. So with those just brief announcements, to welcome you again to the Cairo Lectures. And as usual, we will begin with a musical introduction from our organist and choir master, Dr. Elray Stewart-Cook. Thank you, Elray. And now tonight I have the privilege of introducing Dennis once more, though I will say it's a little bit challenging. Last evening we introduced Dennis with his academic credentials, and then this morning Reed Mueller did such an apt job presenting Dennis's affect and abiding interest in research. I really had to think about what I was going to say this evening. To introduce this, I decided I wanted to tell you a story of when I first came here in January 2021. I was a doctoral student at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, and my doctoral advisor's name is Mark Seifrid. And I'd already left. I was working on my dissertation, and I'd had a teaching position that ended in COVID, and I ended up coming here through a whole variety of things. And he was interested in where I was in life and what this was going to happen. As soon as I had moved to Eugene, I told them, well, I live in Eugene, Oregon now, and he's in St. Louis. And he said, there's someone you need to meet. In Eugene, I know someone through the University of Tübingen. His name's Dennis Lindsay. And you need to make a connection because he's a very generous scholar, and I can't help you like I could if you were here in St. Louis. You need to have someone on the ground. So I think he works at one of the colleges there. You're going to have to figure that out. And of course I responded, Dennis had been the president of the congregation, and the week earlier had just installed me at the church. But I will say Dennis has been a friend indeed over these years of the pastoral character of Dennis's scholarship. Though I will tell you that being an intern here and then as a pastor, it was a little intimidating preaching sermons when present, but after the service, then you'd always have this ability to take the best part of what you just said and say, that's really interesting. Maybe we could think about a new idea. And it has indeed occurred that even now you're living in Tübingen, that after I gave a sermon, because they joined the live stream, that I received an email saying, really interesting interpretation of the Greek particle hos, though I think perhaps there's another way of thinking about this. But very quickly, rather than it becoming a debate about how to understand John chapter 3, it became, how do you pastorally use Greek in sermons to a congregation who doesn't, for the most part, know Greek? How do you make that accessible rather than elitist? And we've continued to have a positive relationship, and I know many people, etc., would have that same feeling. They were so involved for so many years with so many very different things, like the men's breakfast Bible study, or church council, adult education, and preaching in our pulpit, and indeed singing at our Holden evening prayer services. And so, Dennis, with all of your academic credentials, we are glad you're here, but because of your pastoral heart, it was right for you to be here today. It's my honor to welcome Dennis Lindsay.
Thank you very much, Ben. It has been a pure delight for me to be back here with you in this place. And it's home, and always feels like coming home for Karen and me. Karen will be with me tomorrow morning at one of the worship services. So if you're there, you'll get to see her as well. I think probably the true definition of faithfulness has to do with who turns out on a Saturday night in the Cairo lecture series. You have all passed the test. You have demonstrated the best of what faithfulness has to offer. Last night we talked about faith in biblical theological perspective is a relationship with God, an engaged relationship with God. And we looked at the Hebrew scriptures in particular to find this insight of how the Old Testament uses that faith language. This morning, those of you who were with me, we drilled down into Hebrews chapter 11, the so-called faith chapter of the Bible, to discover how faith is a foundation. And what we concluded on that was that Christ himself is the foundation, which is faithfulness. It is it's Jesus' own activity that represents for us a foundation, the faithfulness of God upon which we can stand and upon which we can live. Now, this evening, I want to shift gears a little bit and look at this faithfulness idea from a different angle, and that is the opposite of faith and the rehabilitation of doubt. The desperate confession of the distraught father in Mark 9:24 that we've referred to, and that is kind of the title here of our series, I believe, help my unbelief. This confession signals an existential tension endemic to the human condition. As we saw from our examination of faith in the Hebrews epistle, Christ alone claims the distinction of pioneer and perfecter of faith, beginning and the end of faith. Christ's followers, and that includes us, and all of humanity actually, we struggle constantly somewhere in the middle. We're not the starters of faith, and we're not the perfecters of faith. We are in the middle between a position of faith begun but not yet perfected. The very realization and confession of this inner tension with a plea for Christ's help is itself a sign of maturing faith. Coming to grips with the opposite of faith expressions and tendencies in our lives also helps us to understand more clearly the true nature and implications of faith for our daily living. So I start again here with a little Greek refresher for you, just so that we can get the language here that I'm going to be using, and so that you're clued in with what I'm talking about. In the bold print, on the left-hand side, I've got the words for faith and the verb to believe, to have faith, and the adjective faithful. And then the opposite of these that we find in the New Testament just puts a little a in front of them, or an alpha in Greek. Apistia is unfaith or unfaithfulness. Apistein is to unbelieve or not believe. Apistos is unfaithful. So these are the words that I'm working with this evening as we look at the opposite of faith in the New Testament. But before we delve into the actual opposite of faith and look at these words, it's important to make a couple of clarifications about what is not the opposite of faith in the Bible. And I'm going to begin with this adjective, pistos, faithful, and apistos is unfaithful. Beginning with this idea of unfaithful, the first order of business that we have is to debunk a couple of common misperceptions about the lack or the absence of faith. This brings me to the images that we have on the image that we have on the bulletin, and that we've used for the Cairo material this year. It's the one on the right-hand side, a picture or a painting that is entitled "Still Doubting" by John Granville Gregory. It's in Cathedral of where is it? Elizabeth, help me. Pardon? It's in Wales. Yeah. Mm-hmm. that's a modern painting, but you can see that it clearly is iconically connected to a Caravaggio from 1601, which has the so-called doubting Thomas here, and Jesus invites him to place his finger in his side and look at the nail prints in his hands. I picked this other image because this really contemporizes what Caravaggio had done earlier on, and there's some interesting parallels on it. But I just found it an interesting image, and thought that it goes along nicely with this, particularly as we consider this idea of a doubting Thomas. Now, the problem with this label, doubting Thomas, is not necessarily that Thomas has gotten a bad rap, but rather that he's gotten the wrong rap. Clearly, Thomas, when confronted with the witnesses of Christ's resurrection, demonstrated a serious faith crisis, as we see from his emphatic rejection of the other disciples' testimony. He says, quote, "I will certainly not believe." And the word here is pisteuo. I will certainly not believe. Now, we are quick to infer doubt because of Thomas's insistence on seeing with his own eyes and touching with his own hands the risen Lord. But the explicit word doubt never appears in this passage about Thomas. Nor does Jesus chide Thomas for doubting. Rather, in verse 27, Jesus challenges Thomas to stop being apistos, stop being unfaithful, and instead be pistos, be faithful. Arguably, part of Thomas's problem here was one of doubt, but the indictment against him in this passage is more serious than simply doubting. Jesus warns him not to be unfaithful. By contrast, we might consider the scene at the end of Matthew's Gospel where the 11 disciples are gathered on the Mount of Ascension and the risen Jesus appears to them. Matthew 28:17 reports, when they saw Jesus, they worshiped him, though some doubted. The technical term that we translate as doubt in that passage has a literal meaning of being of two minds. The implication here is that everyone in this scene is engaged in worshiping the risen Lord, but some were still processing back and forth in their minds what all of this should mean. This wrestling of faith is not the opposite of faith. Nor does Jesus reprimand this kind of doubting. Rather, in this passage, in Matthew, he gives his disciples a word of encouragement, a word of commission, and a promise of his ongoing presence with them. Even in their doubt, they were engaged with Jesus through worship. I think that's pretty important. Now, as far as Thomas is concerned, it seemed that he had reached the point in John chapter 20 where he was teetering on the verge of disengagement and ready to check out of the Disciples of Christ hotel. Now, this was not always the case with Thomas. In John chapter 11, a few chapters earlier, as Jesus was setting out to return to Judea because of the death of Lazarus, the disciples protested because of the hostility of the Jewish leaders and the risk of death that awaited there. In this passage, it was Thomas who encouraged the others to stick with Jesus, even if it meant going with him to their deaths. This is a picture of Thomas the pistos, the faithful one, in contrast to Thomas the apistos later in chapter 20. Faithfulness and unfaithfulness, then, are demonstrated in a willingness or a lack thereof to engage with Jesus in steadfast discipleship. This engagement is what Jesus offers Thomas again in John 20:27 with the invitation, put your finger here, touch me, look at my hands, take your hand and touch the wound in my side. engage with me. And Thomas does. He dramatically re-engaged with Jesus. Honest doubt and intellectual wrestling, insofar as they represent serious engagement, are neither the opposites nor the enemies of pistis, of faith. The greater enemy of faith is stubborn disengagement. A second misconception about the opposite of faith has to do with the term little faith, and the Greek word here is oligopistia. Oligos means little, pistia is again from our faith language. So little faith. In the account of Jesus walking on the water in Matthew 14:31, doubt is associated with little faith, a term that is used almost exclusively by Matthew in the New Testament. This is a very rare term, this idea of little faith. And Matthew is really the only one who uses it. Luke uses it in one instance, but it's a parallel instance with Matthew. In this scene, Jesus has rescued Peter from his own failed attempt to walk on the water with the words, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Though Peter demonstrates little faith in this episode, one can hardly fault him with lack of faith, or even worse, the opposite of faith, that is, unfaith. After all, Peter acted upon the invitation of Jesus to get out of the boat and to walk on the water to Jesus. And when suddenly finding himself literally in over his head and beginning to doubt, he cried out to Jesus for salvation. The phenomenon of doubt, the wrestling with fear and uncertainty, while it certainly indicates a faith crisis here, does not imply the opposite of faith. Similarly, in Matthew chapter 16, verse 8, Jesus calls out all of the disciples for their little faith in the midst of their worry and deliberation about not having brought bread along on their boat journey across the lake. In assurance of God's provision for their daily needs, as in Matthew chapter 6, verse 30, where the word little faith occurs again, Jesus reminds the disciples here of the two miracles of the multiplication of the loaves. Then in one other boat incident in Matthew's gospel, in chapter 8, little faith expresses itself in fear and panic as the disciples frantically awaken Jesus in the midst of a storm. We might even think of the fear and panic that we looked at last night among the Israelites prior to crossing of the Red Sea. This storm threatens their existence, and so they display little faith again. In each of these moments in Matthew's gospel, Jesus does not disown or distance himself from his disciples because of their doubt or worry or panic. And indeed, the disciples are not distancing themselves from Jesus when they experience these things. Jesus does not marvel at their unfaith as he does at the unfaith of the people of his hometown Nazareth in Matthew chapter 13. Oligopistia, little faith, is not the same as apistia, unfaith. Jesus engages the little faith of his disciples as a teachable moment to point them to God's own faithfulness and care. There's some interesting other backgrounds about this idea of little faith in some of the rabbinical literature that I harvested from one of my colleagues in Tübingen, but I'm going to skip over that for right now. Only to summarize that little faith is not unproblematic in the life of a disciple of Christ. It certainly presents a set of its own challenges, as we see in all of the instances where it occurs in Matthew's gospel. But little faith also holds potential, presenting a teachable moment for Jesus in the lives of his followers. They do believe, but they need help with their little bit of belief. In these moments of crisis on the sea, at the prospect of the hunger or nakedness, even in the face of unconquerable demons, Jesus is always on hand for his disciples, not to chide or condemn, but to provide salvation, encouragement, and redirection. There's one further, and this might be a little controversial, but very important myth to debunk concerning the opposite of faith that has evolved through the history of Christianity. I've already hinted at this last night in my opening lecture with the focus upon faith as an engaging relationship rather than an intellectual assent to a list of things to be believed. And that is the rejection of ecclesiastical creedal statements is not necessarily the opposite of faith. Here I claim a piece of my own ecclesiastical history as one who was reared in and served in the so-called Stone Campbell movement of Christian churches, disciples of Christ. In their reaction to the extreme and divisive denominationalism of the 19th century American frontier, the leaders of this movement sought to restore the unity of the Church of Christ on earth. This quest necessitated for them the rejection of lengthy, complicated, and generally divisive ecclesiastical creeds and a simple, perhaps a bit naive, return to the Bible as the sole authority for the life of the church, with no creed but Christ. That was one of their slogans. And an open invitation for all Christians from all confessions to join in united fellowship around the Lord's table. Now, regardless of how we judge the naivete of this Enlightenment-shaped movement on the American the American frontier, the history of Christianity itself bears witness to the fact that rejection of ecclesiastical creeds or disagreement with those, whether formalized through ecumenical councils or imposed through sectarian dogmas, both of which tend to be a little bit more socio-political and philosophical than theological, abandonment of those things does not constitute an abandonment of faithfulness to God. There are faithful Christians throughout the world who hold very different opinions on a myriad of issues, both theological and non-theological. Recently, my heart went out to a former student of mine who posted a lengthy statement on his Facebook page announcing that he was walking away from the Christian faith, quote unquote, the Christian faith. Only after he had graduated and moved on from university did I learn that he was gay. In his moving statement, he rehearsed the alienation that he had experienced from church and family members alike, whose condemnation had driven him to reject the quote unquote faith in God that they espoused. It was not difficult to read between the lines that this quote-unquote faith that he was abandoning was much more a matter of doctrine and dogma than it was with a relationship with God. Indeed, in the midst of his pain and alienation, he still clung to some hope in the relational faithfulness of a loving supreme being. Now, regardless of how various ones might judge this particular situation and these issues, I think this is a clear example of the alienating power of creedal dogma and its power to drive people away from faith, away from faithfulness to God. We see plenty of other examples of the same dynamic around other hot-button societal issues that masquerade as theological truths, from ideas of inerrancy of Scripture to social gospel to universalism to teachings about divorce and remarriage to the equal status of women in church leadership, and the list goes on and on and on. Dissent from the dominant point of view in sectarian circles is commonly understood in those circles as an abandonment of the faith. But this understanding of faith trivializes a biblical theological understanding of faith that is rooted in the faithfulness of God, as we talked about this morning, and the reciprocal relational engagement of those who strive to stand firm in God's faithfulness. Now, there is, of course, a creedal element to the biblical understanding of faith, and faith is not void of content. I want to say that very quickly. We saw that from Isaiah's lament, "Lord, who has believed our message?" And we see it up to Jesus' proclamation when he says, "Repent and believe the gospel," in Mark 1:15. We see that faith indeed has objective content, But that content is designated as gospel. And for Isaiah, the content of this good news is the kingdom of God. God reigns as king. And Jesus embodies this very gospel. And Paul spells out clearly, as does Isaiah 53, what this gospel message entails in the first order. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas and the other witnesses of the resurrection. Christ himself is the content of faith incarnate, because Christ fully embodies the kingdom and the righteousness of God. So I would underscore that I do not advocate a sweeping outright rejection of creedal orthodoxy as regards the historic creeds of sectors of the church, past and present. The creedal commitments of different Christian groups in different places and times have value in that they help their respective faith communities to define common mission emphases related to discipleship and evangelism from the perspective of their own unique circumstances within the body of Christ. But to elevate peripheral matters of dogma and opinion to the level of importance that we give to the foundational faithfulness of God is to detract from the precious cornerstone and sure foundation that God has laid in the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, and to make those other peripheral matters central invites those who dissent to abandon their faithfulness to God altogether. And Jesus warns that someone who causes people to stumble in their faith, it would be better for them to have a millstone hung around their neck and cast into the sea. It's serious business. Okay, so if not doubt or little faith or intellectual dissent to creeds and dogmas, what then from a biblical theological perspective is the opposite of faith? The Greek word, or back to our Greek lesson again, the Greek word for unbelief in Mark 9:24, the passage that we've got in the title of our series, is apistia, unfaith. Now, the alpha, as a prefix to Greek words, functions similarly to the UN prefix in English. And it denotes a negation, an opposite of the word to which it is prefixed. And so here I am always reminded of the 1970s advertisement of 7-Up, the Uncola. I thought this was a lovely advert here because you get here, you get information, the Uncola, break through to the unside, 7-Up, the Uncola. Yeah, everything is here. It's the opposite of cola. And it was appropriately derived from the uncola nut, as I recall. When it comes to the Greek prefix on our pistis words, the noun for faith, it's clearly signifying the opposite. We see this prefix in the Greek New Testament not only with the noun unfaith, but also with the verb unbelieve, and with the adjective, which I think allows the most natural English translation that's most understandable for us, unfaithful. Unfaithfulness is really the general sense of the apistos, apistia, and apistein lexicon in the New Testament. We encounter this nuance in Matthew 13:58 with its parallel in Mark chapter 6. In the account where Jesus visits his hometown and is met with the scorn of the townsfolk. Matthew reports that Jesus did not perform many works of power there because of their unfaith, because of their apistia. Mark's account of the event takes it a step further and says that Jesus was unable to perform any powerful sign there except for laying hands on a few sick people. Moreover, according to Mark's account, Jesus was amazed at their unfaith, at their apistia. So what was the nature of this unfaith of the people of the town of Nazareth, Jesus' hometown folk? On the one hand, It is clear from the text that the townsfolk recognized and acknowledged that Jesus displayed and possessed the wisdom and the power of God. This subtle acknowledgement that Jesus possessed and displayed God's wisdom and power appears in the force of their rhetorical question. They ask, where did he obtain this wisdom and these powerful signs? Well, the obvious answer is what caused their amazement. A fearful, panic-stricken amazement. The kind of amazement expressed by the verb used here at this point in the New Testament is the kind of amazement that describes the reaction of individuals and groups of individuals who realize that they have had an encounter with the divine. The familiar townsfolk recognized here that there was more to Jesus than what his upbringing in Nazareth and his family heritage had provided. And this realization caused consternation for them. It was a fearful, awful epiphany for them. But this amazement itself does not constitute their unfaith. Rather, it was the way that they dealt with the amazement. Matthew says, in Matthew's account, it says that they took offense at Jesus. The verb here is the verb skandalizo in Greek. I think I've got it up there. It's the word that we get scandalized from in the English. They were scandalized by Jesus. They took offense at him. This Greek verb for taking offense in this passage is this scandalize again. But the idea, the notion of taking offense, quote unquote, doesn't really capture the full impact of the Greek verb in this passage. If we look to Luke's parallel account in Luke chapter 4, verses 8 to 29, the unbelief of the people of Nazareth takes the form of mortal hatred, resulting in the attempt to lynch Jesus and to hurl him off the cliff. Gustav Stalin, who writes an article on this word skandalizo in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, says that the offense, that skandalizo in this passage for the Pharisees is more than just feeling hurt. The primary meaning of this word is a deep religious offense at the preaching of Jesus. And this both causes and includes denial and rejection of Jesus. Likewise, the Nazareth townfolk reacted to Jesus as a local scandal. This reaction was the heart of their unfaith, the heart of their unbelief. In this concept of scandal and offense, then, it appears that we have a true opposite of a biblical theological understanding of pistis. This is a very this word skandalizo is a very unique term in the New Testament, and it carries an interesting background. The likely base meaning of the noun skandalon, or scandal, we might transliterate it, from ancient Greek sources, has to do with the idea of a trap or a snare, something that something that catches you and leads to ruin. But the verb skandalizo, the action word, to be scandalized, is very rare, and get this, you never find this word anywhere outside the biblical texts. This verb, though, appears 30 times in the New Testament. It only appears 4 times in the Greek Old Testament, but 30 times in the New Testament, and then you don't find it anywhere else. So it's the New Testament usage itself that determines how we are to understand this verb skandalizo. The occurrences in the New Testament are fairly evenly divided between the active use of the verb and the passive use of the verb, to scandalize or to be scandalized. If we look at the passive use of the verb, to be scandalized or to take offense, we find that these uses have almost exclusively a Christological focus. It has to do with taking offense at Jesus himself, causing one self offense in relationship to Jesus. In practical terms, this taking offense at Jesus is tantamount to a willful and in some instances a hostile rejection of Jesus and his teachings, as we see from Luke's account of Jesus in Nazareth. In Matthew chapter 26, verses 31 to 33, Jesus predicts the falling away of his disciples when he's about to be handed over to the Jewish leaders. In his exchange with his disciples here, and with Peter, this verb scandalizo occurs 3 times. The New Revised Standard Version translates the verb here as desert. Jesus said, "You will all become deserters of me because of me this night." Peter goes on to say, "Even if everyone else deserts you, I will not desert you." We have the verb 3 times here in this passage. The larger context of this passage makes it very clear what it means for these disciples to take offense at Jesus as they deny relationship and distance themselves from him. And that's what happens in this context. Just a footnote on this. This occurred to me as I was going over this lecture in preparation. This is different than betrayal of Jesus. This desertion of Jesus is different than betrayal. Betrayal still involves relationship. But scandalizo, to be scandalized, is a denial of relationship. That's a hard, I think a hard point to make here. We find the same nuance in John chapter 6, verse 61, where some of the disciples were scandalized. They were offended by Jesus' teaching about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. And in this context, Jesus levels the accusation against them, saying, "There are some of you who do not believe." Opposite of faith. Their offense and their unbelief demonstrates itself then in verse 66 of John chapter 6, where we read that they actually stopped following after Jesus. Perhaps the language there indicates they stopped being disciples and they no longer accompanied him in his missionary travels. That this response is the opposite of faith is underscored in Jesus' further exchange with the 12 that we talked about this morning, and Peter's confession when Jesus said, "Are you going to abandon me as well?" And Peter replies with the well-known confession of faith, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed," pistuo, "we have believed and have known," gnosko, "that you are the Holy One of God." It's clear from this passage, both one, that the opposite of faith involves a rejection of relationship and a desertion of Jesus, and 2, that faith itself is a matter of standing firm in relationship with the one who has the words of eternal life. There is a further interesting notion embedded within this passage with Peter's question, "To whom else shall we go?" This question suggests that the rejection of Jesus, which is the opposite of faith in this passage, is not simply a matter of discontinued relationship with Jesus. It is at the same time an active search for someone or something else worthy of devotion and relationship. This was perhaps the dilemma posed by John the Baptist from his prison cell when he sent his own disciples to ask Jesus whether he was the one who is to come or whether they should expect someone else. After directing John's disciples to go back and report the things that they were seeing and hearing in Jesus' ministry, Jesus adds this word of benediction: "Blessed is whoever does not scandalizo," does not take offense, does not turn away, does not abandon, does not reject, does not desert me. There's a blessing in staying in relationship with Jesus. In this light, it is significant that in a few key passages in the Septuagint, where the word, where the noun skandalon occurs, that skandalon, this trap, this idea of a trap or a snare, is directly related to the worship of idols rather than to the worship of God. The stubborn refusal to engage with God And the incumbent choice to engage with someone or something else is the direct opposite of the steadfast, we might even say the stubborn determination to stay in relationship with God, which is pistis, faithfulness. Now, according to Stalin, once again, both formally and materially, the New Testament use of this of these words scandalon, scandal, and scandalizo, to be scandalized, this is exclusively controlled by the thought and speech of the Old Testament and Judaism. And he points out that the two words are used almost exclusively by the authors whose roots are in Judaism, Matthew and Paul. Stalin flags up, however, a penchant of Luke's gospel to express the same thing in another way. This is especially interesting in two particular parallel passages where Matthew employs the verb scandalizo and Luke uses another expression. In the parable of the sower in Matthew chapter 13, verse 21, Jesus explained that the seed sown on the rocky soil, because it did not have sufficient root, it sprouts up quickly, but then this seed immediately is scandalized. It immediately takes offense. It immediately abandons. In the Lucan version, in Luke chapter 8, the ones who represent the seed sown on the rocky soil are described in this way. They are believing for a little while. But when the time of trial comes, they abandon. Here, Luke's version makes explicit what Matthew's version implies. Taking offense at or abandoning the word is the opposite of faithfulness, the opposite of pistis. We find the same nuance in Luke's reworking of Jesus' prediction of Peter's denial in comparison to Matthew. We've already noted the passage in Matthew 26 where the verb scandalizo appears 3 times, and Jesus predicts, "You will all desert me." Peter says, "No, I won't desert you, even if everybody else deserts you." In Luke 22, however, Jesus' prediction of Peter's denial is predicated not by a prediction that everyone will desert Jesus, but rather by Jesus' prayer for Peter that Peter's pistis will not fail, that his pistis will not be eclipsed is the Greek word here. It's fairly clear that Luke understands faith as the opposite of Matthew's scandalizo. Paul also reveals the same understanding of these opposites in Romans chapter 9, verses 30 to 33, with his judgment that Israel's reliance for righteousness based upon works instead of faith led to their stumbling over the rock of stumbling. In this passage, Paul cites Isaiah 28:16, passage that we looked at this morning, alongside Isaiah 8:14, linking the two prophetic texts with a common interpretation of the word stone that God establishes in the sanctuary of Zion, this foundation stone. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 7 strikes the same chord, again linking Isaiah 28:16 with Isaiah 8:14, but also with Psalm 118:22 and the cornerstone, the stone that the builders rejected, making it very explicit that the unbelieving response on the part of the unbelieving builders is to reject the divinely laid foundation stone. For them, it becomes a stone of stumbling, a matter of scandalizo. For the believers, on the other hand, this precious stone has become the chief cornerstone and the basis for life. It's worth noting also that Matthew and Paul both use the verb scandalizo in the active sense of causing someone's faith to fail. We find this nuance particularly in Matthew 18:6, where Jesus declares to his disciples, "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, to be scandalized, it would be better for them to have the heavy millstone hung around their neck and thrown into the depths of the sea." So, taking offense at Jesus, particularly from the perspective of both Matthew's gospel and Paul, is a matter of willful, intentional, stubborn rejection and abandonment of Jesus as the Holy One of God. The stubborn, often hostile rejection of Jesus becomes a self-laid trap and lies at the root of apistia, the opposite of faith. Just as taking offense at Jesus is a matter of stubborn, willful rejection, so also causing others to take offense is portrayed here as a matter of stubborn and willful self-interest. Other occurrences of apistia in the New Testament support this assessment that the opposite of faith amounts to this willful rejection of God. We find other words like rebellion and apostasy, some of these words coming out of the Hebrews epistle. To be guilty of apistia is to be hardened in the deception of sins, and it is the direct opposite of holding firm to the foundation that is laid by God, inconsistent with participation in Christ. It's also synonymous with hard-heartedness, sclerocardia, which demonstrates itself in a stubborn refusal to believe the testimony of eyewitnesses of the risen Lord. So that's the sense that we have here. And it bears noting also that wherever this unfaith arises, idolatry, the deliberate choice to place faith in someone or something other than the foundation stone that God provides, idolatry is never far away from the surface. So, is there help for unfaith? This is perhaps the final and an extremely important observation about the opposite of faith. And that is that there is help for human apistia, regardless of how innocent, regardless how intentional, regardless how severe. There is help for the one who is wrestling to maintain faith. And there's help for the ones who, like my former student, have deliberately turned their backs. To return for a moment to John the Baptist and his disciples in Matthew chapter 11, with their questions to and about Jesus and whether he was the one who was to come, we shouldn't suppose that they were approaching him with hardened hearts or entertaining the notion of turning to idols or bent on breaking faith with God. Their question was sincere and their searching was authentic. And Jesus' gentle response was an affirmation of their faith, even in their questioning. His eschatological beatitude upon them, upon those who do not take offense in him, was an encouragement for them to stand firm in their faithfulness. While it is true that fear and worry and cowardly panic, doubt and flagging confidence are factors that can weaken a firm stance in faith and result perhaps in little faith, the actual opposite of faith is much more diabolical and much more ruinous. The intellectual questioning of or dissent from extraneous creedal formula also need not indicate a lack of faith. The gravely serious issue of unfaith in this biblical theological perspective is that it involves a deliberate, stubborn abandonment of Jesus in preference of someone or something else. But even for Peter, as we have seen, who actually did desert Jesus in the crisis of his betrayal, there was help for his unbelief. That the help came even before that betrayal. Jesus prays for him that his pistis will not be eclipsed, that his faith will not depart. The Father's desperate cry to Jesus in Mark 9:24, "I believe, help my unbelief," along with Jesus' subsequent casting out of the demon, sends a clear signal that there is divine help for human apistia, regardless of how innocent or how diabolical. We've already encountered many instances in the gospel accounts where Jesus personally challenges the lack of faith or little faith among his disciples and calls them instead to further faith in him. It's important to know that Jesus initiates this engagement and call to faith. This is the case in John 20 when Jesus initiates the encounter with Thomas, inviting him to see with his own eyes and touch with his own hands, and thus enabling him to turn from his apistia to pistis, to believe. And in this context, there's also a beatitude for those who believe without having to have the Thomas experience. This is comparable to the beatitude spoken in connection with John the Baptist and his disciples. Likewise, when the resurrected Jesus appears and breaks bread with the two disillusioned and perplexed disciples on the Emmaus road, Jesus gently chides them for being foolish and slow of heart to believe, pisteuo. But the language is stronger later at the end of Mark's gospel when the risen Lord appeared to the 11 disciples and rakes them over the coals for their unbelief and their hardness of heart in their refusal to believe the reports of other eyewitnesses. But in all of these instances, there's clearly help for the disciples of Christ who struggle with unfaith. And as these passages indicate, this help comes in the form of a sacramental encounter with the risen Lord. But what about those who from the outset take offense at Jesus and reject him? Is there help for this kind of stubborn apistia? Or are these deliberate unbelievers hopelessly doomed to perish in this snare of their own choosing? The Apostle Paul offers a clear answer, I think. And it's significant that Paul almost exclusively uses the noun and verb for unbelief in the context of this very question. Romans 3:3 poses the rhetorical question concerning his Jewish fellows who stubbornly rejected the righteousness of God revealed in the gospel from faith to faith. What then, Paul says, if some of them were unfaithful? Their unfaithfulness, their apistia, doesn't nullify the pistis, the faithfulness of God, does it? The obvious answer in verse 4 is an emphatic no. Rather, the opposite is true. God's faithfulness ultimately outlasts all human unfaithfulness. In verse 4, Paul cites from the Septuagint text of Psalm 51:6 and affirms God's ultimate victory and justice over human sin through the power of forgiveness. Paul returns to this theme with his eschatological parable of the olive tree in Romans chapter 11, verses 11 to 24, applying to the Jews the judgment of Psalm 69:23 with reference to their having fallen into the trap of offense, the scandal, because of their darkened eyes and bent backs. Paul again asks rhetorically, they didn't stumble so as to fall into ruin, did they? And again, the answer is a resounding no. They are indeed fruitless branches on the olive tree that have been pruned from the tree because of apistia, because of unfaith, whereas the wild olive Gentiles have been grafted into the tree because of pistis. But, Paul says, if they do not stubbornly remain in their unfaith, in their apistia, these unfruitful, now dead branches will be grafted back into the living tree, quote, because God is powerfully able to graft them back in again, end quote. There is help for even the most stubborn unfaithfulness. And this help is rooted in the absolute faithfulness of God, a theme that we see echoed in the faithful word, the pistos halagos of 2 Timothy 2:13, where it says, if we are unfaithful, he remains pistos. He remains faithful. There is both current help and eschatological hope for people who stumble into the trap of stubborn resistance to God. Now, I repeat that. There is current help and eschatological hope for people who stumble into the trap of stubborn resistance to God. This is the core theme of the parables of the lost sheep or the lost coin or the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. It's interesting to note that in the third of these parables, these lost-found parables, the prodigal son, the restoration of this prodigal son is likened to the resurrection from the dead. Even the destruction and ruin of death is unable to nullify the Father's faithful restorative forgiveness in this passage. The antidote for all unfaith, for all apistia, is rooted in the rock-solid faithfulness of God in Jesus Christ, who provides the foundation stone, a foundational bulwark against which even the gates of death and the gates of hell cannot prevail. The wise builder chooses to build his house on this foundation, secure from the onslaught of all hell breaking loose. But even for the foolish builder, who, like the prodigal son, chooses instead a foundation of sand to build his house, doomed for destruction, even for him there's hope. The living God, who created and sustains all things, in whom we all live and move and exist, is never far from anyone, as we read in Acts 17. The choice foundation stone that God has provided is eternally present, and the one who stands firm on that foundation will not shrink back, but will experience God's salvation. Thank you. Okay, these are good questions that are coming in here. Here's an easy one. What distinction would you make regarding fidelity and faithfulness? No distinction whatsoever. Faithfulness is a matter of fidelity. This is a relational thing, and of course fidelity is all encompassing in a relationship. I don't know if that answers that question or not. Let's see. Well, I'll just start in here. I was interested to see what we had. Faith being a steadfast relationship to God, what about our relationship with other believers? In this era, or even believers professing they have this relationship with God on their own without relationship with other witnesses. Can they have that relationship? That's a good question. And interest. Well, I'm not sure I caught them all. Faith being a steadfast relationship to God, the question is, what about our relationship with other believers? Okay? I think that's the basic question. This is I think, a very important question that's coming in here, and a point that I'll talk about in terms of another experience that I had just 2 weeks ago in Germany. Our institute co-sponsored with the theological faculty at the university an international symposium on the double commandment of love, love for God and love for neighbor. And I think that's how I would answer this one here. A faithful relationship to God cannot be realized without faithfulness in our relationship with other people. It has both the vertical and the horizontal impact there. To love God and to love one's neighbor as oneself, these go hand in hand, and you can't have really one without the other. It comes up particularly in the language of 1 John. It's impossible for us to love God whom we have seen if we don't love our neighbor whom we haven't seen. So I'll also say this, and particularly thinking about this idea of faith and faithfulness in the Johannine literature, and particularly in the Gospel of John. I don't know if any of you had a chance to look at the article that I wrote on John's provocative theology of faith. I suggested there that John's gospel has a lot of synonyms for believing, one of which is to love. And so these are all relational words. And I think it is impossible to be in a steadfast relationship with God without being in that steadfast relationship with one another as well. Let's see. God's faith graces an unbeliever. Is damnation something we don't have to concern ourselves with for our friends and family who are unbelievers? Also, how is it that all of humanity are followers of Christ? I'm going to say I have an idea, but I don't know the answer on this. I think we have a responsibility as Christians to share the gospel that God reigns as King. This is the content of faith, as it were, that I've been talking about here, and the message of who Jesus is and what Jesus does for us. We don't have the power to make seeds grow. We only have the power to distribute those seeds and try to cultivate sparks of faith wherever we see that, to fan it into flame. And concern for ourselves, for friends and family who are unbelievers, this is a painful thing for many people, and rightly so. We don't want the people that we love not to experience the goodness of God. I will say a little bit about this in my lecture tomorrow as well, because I'm going to be coming back to the gift of community and that what it means for us to be faithful, and the impact that has on the lives of those that we come into contact with, both as individuals and as a believing community. I think that our faithfulness is perhaps more powerful than what we may realize sometimes. One of the passages that I wrestle with this particular idea comes from 1 Corinthians, where Paul has his advice for married couples who are married to unbelieving spouses. And he advises them, don't seek to separate yourself from that person. You have no idea whether or not your influence might be a matter of salvation for them. I think Christian faithfulness may very well have a positive impact upon those with whom we come into contact. Planting seeds that we may never see come to fruition. And I will also say this, the more I think about this, and this may be controversial as well, but the more I think about this, I don't think that death is the final has the final say in any of this. We worry about someone, did they accept Jesus before they died? And if they didn't, are they going to hell? I believe that the gates of death cannot prevail against the faithfulness of God. Now, I don't know how that functions. I don't know what that means, but I do know, or I do believe that God's faithfulness is much greater than what we can conceive of in our own human our own human categories. And I would certainly want to preach that as gospel as well. Can we assert God in his faithfulness, will one day restore Israel to faith in the Messiah. I think Paul thinks so in Romans chapter 11, but it's an eschatological event there, and I think Paul understands it in the same way that Paul autobiographically had experienced this. When Jesus shows up, you really don't have much choice other than to say, "Who are you, Lord?" Right? This is what happened to Paul on the road to Damascus. He wasn't looking to be converted in any way, but Jesus shows up, and it makes a change. And I think that experience of Paul's is what he's founding some of this on. Jesus is going to show up in everyone's lives, even those who die. What happens when Jesus shows up? Well, he says in another passage, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus is Lord to the glory of the Father. Do people who confess that Jesus is Lord to the glory of the Father, are they going to go to hell? Okay. So anyway, I think that there is an eschatological, an end time, at the very last time, expectation that there probably are going to be a lot more people in heaven than what we sometimes realize. Okay, here's this one. I find your opposite of faith to be willful, stubborn resistance to God convincing. But what of those today in the religious nuns who show a lack of interest in faith, one way or another? Does this discourse speak to that group? Well, I hope it does. I'm not sure that... I think that this actually kind of goes in with some of the other things I've been saying about loved ones and others who are not really concerned about God. There are a lot of people who are in this religious nun zone who claim no relationship whatsoever with God or religion, but they can't really claim not to have that relationship without knowing that there is that relationship possible. And I think that in itself, again, is a little window of hope for them in this life, but also in life to come. And so, in that sense, I would say, yes, this discourse speaks to that group. I think there is help for that kind of, I don't know if it's unbelief or just agnosticism. I don't know if it's a stubborn resistance to God or just a kind of an indifference.
Or it might be a stubborn resistance to creedal doctrine.
Or it might be and that's absolutely got to be a part of the dynamic with that as well. A stubborn resistance to what people perceive as God is all about, especially when they look at their churches or other churches or Christian groups, and they find objectionable things there, and they say, "I can't go there." Right?
I'm thinking about your young man and his Facebook post.
Yep.
And that young man may continue to have a relationship with God, and we don't know how that will play out.
Yeah, and that, as I've thought about that, his outpouring on Facebook is not the end of the story.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
my story is similar.
Yeah.
I mean, here I sit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
God is faithful even to the unbeliever. And what is the unforgivable sin about?
Okay. Headed into other territory here. This unforgivable sin, this so-called sin against the Holy Spirit, and that is actually a stubborn refusal to engage with God. And there were those who were who were guilty of that. The first letter of John also makes reference to sin that leads to death and a sin that doesn't lead to death and that sort of thing. That's kind of murky territory in my mind, and I'm not sure that what I've had to say about faith really speaks to those. I think I'd have to consider that a little bit more carefully, which I didn't do in any of this. Yeah. But I mean, that is an interesting question, and I think a good counter argument to perhaps what I've been putting forward here. I don't claim to know everything about faith, and there are complexities here that we don't know about. Yeah. What I do know, though, is that this so-called unforgivable sin doesn't play a very prominent role in the biblical canon. It only comes up in this in a couple of instances. Yeah. Andrew?
Thank you so much. Your comment about skepticism being not outside the New Testament really got me thinking. And I'm not going to ask you to speculate as to why that does show up. Maybe some purely area, but it got me wondering about the language of scandal and the discourse of faith that we see in the New Testament authors. And I'm just curious, have you looked kind of beyond the other Hellenistic Jewish thinkers who are wrestling with these issues? Do they speak in similar ways? Is there a unique discourse about faith in these early Christian authors, or have you looked at that?
Yeah, I haven't looked at all of it, but in a couple of the other lectures, I've pointed to the work of Teresa Morgan. Are you familiar with her tome on Christian faith and Roman faith? Her work is really very interesting because whereas in the 20th century, a lot of the scholarship around this faith language was headed in the direction that the New Testament just is taking over a Hellenistic, a secular terminology, and it really does go down this route of intellectual belief in facts and things like that. Morgan's work demonstrates, I think, convincingly that isn't necessarily the case in Hellenism and Hellenistic Greek, that the pistis language is a lot closer to what we find in the New Testament. Now, the New Testament is using it more nuanced in this way, but it's not foreign. It's not a foreign nuance. And so I would say that in terms of that particular thing. There's some other scholars who are working on that same thing right now. Trying to remember her name in one of the Nordic countries. I met her at the International SBL meeting this last August, and she's also working with this pistis language in its philosophical context and the Hellenistic context, and has done some work with some of my work, and was kind of pushing back a little bit on some things. And I've come around, I think, a little bit more. When I first got into this, and I was reacting pretty strongly against the work that Rudolf Bultmann had done in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. And this was at the urging of my doctor father at the time. He said he didn't think that Bultmann was doing an adequate job of it. And so this was my doctoral work, where I compared how the New Testament uses that language with how Flavius Josephus uses the language. And there is a very clear difference. Josephus doesn't use this he uses the language of pistis as frequently as the New Testament does, but certainly not in the same way. So there are differences, but there are also some similarities. Yeah. One more here. I'm curious about the connection of scandalon and idolatry. I find this helpful But then does the idea relate to what Paul says of Israel in Romans 9:30-30, or the Jews as scandalon in 1 Corinthians 1:23? Is Paul suggesting or insinuating then to say that Israel are in idolatry after the challenge of the cross of Christ? Perhaps. I think that would be worth exploring. Certainly, a lot of these passages that are coming up here with the faith language are connected with those Old Testament passages where the prophets are also very much concerned with Israel's idolatry, and that idolatry is is the opposite of faith. Yeah. Ken. Yeah.
That's what you're about to say. I was struck by that as well as this intentional disbelief in God, but the tendency to want to believe in something else.
Yes. Yeah.
That's fundamental human nature that we need something to believe in.
Well, it may well be. Can we live without relationship? Can we? It is not good for the man to be alone. You know? Can we live without relationship? I think we can exist without relationship, but not very easily and not very fruitfully. And so when it comes to relationship with God, I mean, God initiates this relationship. For us, it's a matter of do we take that nehmen wir das wahr oder nicht? Do we grab hold of that and take hold of that relationship, or do we reject it and seek relationship elsewhere? And you know, that's the John 6 passage. I think that's what was going on there with Jesus' disciples. They were turning away, going somewhere else. And that was John the Baptist's question. Are you the one, or is there someone else? And again, John was not looking for an idol to worship. He was looking for the one who is to come. But others turn to idols, which becomes for them this scandal, this trap, which leads to ruin. Yeah. Any other questions? There will be another chance for questions tomorrow. When we kind of wrap this up and consider the idea of this faith that we've been talking about as a gift, and what does that mean? So, yeah, thank you.